Hey everyone, welcome back to Rocks for Jocks. I have a really special episode today where I got to interview David B. Williams, author of the book Stories in Stone. It's a book that walks us through some of the many ways that geology weaves itself into human history, especially in urban environments like Boston and Seattle. If you like this episode, number 1, subscribe to Rocks for Jocks wherever you're listening. Number 2, go ahead and send this episode to a friend. Number 3, subscribe to Rocks for Jocks on Substack. You'll get podcasts and newsletters sent straight to your inbox every time I release them. So I'll make sure to put that link in the notes to this episode. Now, enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. Yeah. Thanks so much for sending me your book, Stories in Stone, all about urban geology. I really enjoyed it. Got almost to the very end here. I'm a pretty slow reader, so for me, a book in a month is pretty good.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, but it was great. It's really poetic and all about, as the title suggests, the different stories that you can find throughout geology, especially in urban environments. Maybe not a special focus on that, but that's at least the parts that I found most interesting as a urban dweller. Um,
Yes.
yeah, do you want to maybe talk to me a little bit about it in just kind of a brief intro?
Yeah. I'll a little bit of background. So I have a degree in geology, and after college ended up in southern Utah, where I worked for a little nonprofit field school and for the National Park Service, and basically became addicted to geology. I was in the Red Rock country, it's arguably some of the most beautiful rocks anywhere. And I was used to that daily dose of looking out my window and seeing the stunning landscape and hiking and biking and canoeing in it. And my wife and I moved to Boston for her to attend grad school, and I lost that connection. I mean, as I sort of like to joke, the only thing I knew about geology on the East Coast was Plymouth Rock. But as I started wandering around Boston, I started noticing the building stone and just the incredible variety of rock, the fact that it's polished and easily accessible and from all over the world as I began to discover. So that really was my sort of initial entree into this field of building stone, of trying to make a connection to place through the geology that I could find around me. And in Boston, the most obvious was in the buildings.
So yeah, you want to talk to me about that a little bit then? I know we talked about Harvard a little bit the last time we spoke and some of the buildings that you looked at there.
Yeah, exactly. So I distinctly remember one day going up to Harvard Hall, which I guess is one of the older buildings on the Harvard campus, and at the base on the stairs was what I had learned in the East Coast was called brownstone. And I remember, unfortunately, I don't think Harvard people really approve of you hitting their buildings with a rock hammer, which is, ridiculous. Seems like we should be able to do that. But no, so I end up sort of rubbing the building or just sort of running my hand over the sandstone and realizing that the grains that are accumulating in my hand are the same basically material as I was seeing in southern Utah. This landscape that I was, deeply invested in, sort of emotionally, physically, and it really made that connection to me, that very tangible connection that the brownstone of Boston, New York, Philly, the East Coast was basically the exact same rock as the red rock of southern Utah. They're basically a sandstone with a little bit of rust, and even some of it forming at a similar age. Much of the brownstone's about 200 million years old, and there's plenty of red rock that's in that age range too. So that, excuse the pun, really sort of grounded me to place and really helped me a develop the connection, but b then start getting interested in what are the stories of these, what's not just the geologic story, what are the human stories of these buildings, and why is certain rock used, what does it tell us? And I'm sure you've sort of had this similar experience that people, I think you can explain geology to them, but if you can make them connect to it through people, they're going to be that much more engaged in it. And to me, I realized this idea that you could tell the stories of both people and geology through the building stone. And that just seemed to me a wonderful way to share stories. And so I began to write about them for a variety of different magazines. I think the first one was I did one for the Harvard Alumni Magazine, looking at the different building stone on the Harvard campus. And then that grew into this book project.
Wow. Okay, so then that kind of leads into the first question I had for you here. Um, Being in Boston, I see these brownstones every day. Totally understand how they have that kind of brown red with like a little bit of rust color. Um, Curious if you can tell me a little bit about how you were able to identify that as sandstone so easily, and how that looked to you to be the same as the type of rocks that you saw out in Utah.
Yeah, yeah, good question. I mean, I think, what do you do when you're out in the field? You break the rock up and look at it, and can't do that in the urban environment. So done it, certain rocks stand out. I mean, the sandstone of the brownstone is a classic sandstone with sand grains. It's layered, and there's some cross bedding in it, so it looks just like a sandstone. So I just from that point I started looking, and I'm not the first to think about this subject. So ended up coming across a few papers about geology of building stones in Boston and came across the reference to the brownstone. And then as I started looking and figuring out, oh, it's quarried from primarily from areas in the Connecticut River Valley, and then was able to track down that the rock is called the Portland Formation. I eventually went to the quarry, one of the main brownstone quarries up in Connecticut, and yeah, just fascinating to see. It's now completely flooded, which is often the case for historic quarries because they're cutting down, they're getting into the groundwater. They always had to pump water out of the quarries, but this one is basically flooded, but was able to clearly see the brownstone. I mean, it's such a I wouldn't say unique, but just a classic looking sandstone. So with that, I then started, looking at other rocks, and you can see granites. In the building trade, there's really only two types of rock. There's marble and granite. And marble can be anything, often is limestone, and granite could be anything. It could be a gneiss, it could be a schist, it could be what geologists would break up into smaller and smaller families. But those seem to be the two types of rock. If it's granular, it's granite. If it's sort of layered, it's a marble. And from that point, you realize you got to do the investigating to figure out, because what it's called and what it is are not always the same things. But once you dive in, yeah, it becomes pretty obvious, particularly again because they've polished them, and so they're really nice cross sections of the rock.
Yeah. So, okay, I had a question about that as well because that was something you mentioned. I think in the part of this book you're writing about Michelangelo and some of the rock that he sourced, and you had a quote that stuck out to me about the marble, where you said something like his version of marble is very different from what we colloquially call marble today. Yeah, can you talk to me a little bit about what the difference is between, and maybe like an official definition of marble and granite versus what when we query granite from Quincy and bring it all over New England, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the building trade, a marble is anything that's sort of colorful and layered. You think of some of the classic marbles, like you walking through, say, the Boston Public Library, all those beautiful rocks in the wall there. Much of that is called marble, whether it is or isn't. And it's that sort of generic term along that on that spectrum. I mean, I've talked to architects, and basically every rock is marble practically to them. And marble, I think, is used because it has cachet. It has standing. People think, oh, going back to Michelangelo, Michelangelo carved in the Carrara marble, which is a true marble. It's a limestone that was metamorphosed and made and converted into a marble. But people like to use that phrase because it sounds, I mean, what are you gonna, would you rather have a building that's made with, marble or limestone? I mean, I love limestone, but it doesn't have the cachet. And I think granite, the very granular rock, again, there's a feeling of granite as a resistant rock, as strong. I mean, there's a reason you see banks made out of granite. They're trying to convey a simple message. So, granite has certain chemistry in it. And I get why it's called granite instead of granite diorite or cyanide or any of the other different names. It's easier, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Did you have a favorite type of rock that you found yourself coming to terms with during this book?
I mean, I still I'm partial to sandstone just because of my love for Southern Utah and the brownstones. And I mean, I guess in some ways the rock that I find most appealing is gneiss, and in particular the Morton gneiss that I wrote about, which again in the building trade is called rainbow granite. Well, it ain't no granite; it's nice, classic looking sort of migmatite. But what I love about it is it's probably the oldest rock I will ever see in my life. It's 3.5 billion years old, quarried from Minnesota, part of the North American Craton. And regularly still lead building stone tours in Seattle. And I show people that one, I think the rock is just beautiful. It's sort of, I like to think of it as this sort of mix, sort of looks a little bit like if you took brownies and bubble gum. There's sort of a pinkish blackishness, and you swirled those together, and you have these layers of black and pinkish with little dots of white in it. I mean, it's a beautiful, it's very, even though it's 3.5 billion years old, it still looks to be in motion. There's a dynamic to it that I think is pretty special. But the fact that it is so old, I love telling people to reach out and touch it, that you're reaching back into that arguably one of the greatest concepts of geology is deep time. And that rock just personifies it, that you're reaching back, 80% of the age of the Earth, so far back in time that Earth didn't look anything like it did. There were no multicellular organisms, there were only single-celled organisms on the planet. And there's this debate whether plate tectonics even operated as it does at present 3.5 billion years ago. So I love that, again, that aspect of it, that it's these really wonderful geology stories, but it's also a rock that you see very regularly in Art Deco buildings, which is a type of architecture I like. Art Deco at the very geometric shapes, and often a building that's a single color. Often they use a single color, but then at the base they'll put this Morton gneiss, and it adds this dynamic and this color to it. So again, it unites the geologic stories that I find interesting and the human stories that I find interesting.
Yeah, that's really good to hear about as well. When you talk about rocks having a certain age, is that typically the age at which a were first formed and they've continued changing since then, or is that kind of the time period where they stopped changing and that's how it's looked for the last 3.5 billion years?
Yeah, the Morton gneiss is a complicated one because there's the oldest part's 3.5, but then there's a part of it, the sort of pinkish, is about 2.7 billion years old. So again, it's a metamorphosed rock, and the oldest part of it is this 3.5 billion. I mean, that's, I think, an unusual one that has this sort of bimodal life to it versus a sandstone, which, you're seeing it as it's whatever age it is that age at which it formed, and it's basically remained unchanged since the time of formation. Like the brownstone at 200 million years ago, it forms in these valleys as Pangea is starting to break up, at the Atlantic Ocean starting to form, and mountains are depositing, shedding sediment into a valley and or valleys, and that's when you get that brownstone forming. So that's that snapshot in time. If however long it takes to form, which is obviously tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, if not more.
Another thing I wanted to get your opinion on was about the petrified wood that is, I believe it's on the cover of the book.
Yes.
Yeah, just a really cool chapter, I guess, about all the history behind this one gas station. It's in a pretty rural area. It was originally built, I don't want to take the wind out of your sails too much, but if I remember right, is kind of originally built with these pieces of petrified wood. They were once wood millions of years ago, and they're now considered rock. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah. So I mean that's a great. I mean, the petrified wood gas station is a fun story on many levels. I forget how I had found out about it, but it's in this little town in eastern Colorado, this town of Lamar. The gas station was built in the early 1930s, just as cars are starting to become more popular, and this style of architecture, this vernacular style of architecture, starts to become popular because people are trying to figure out how do we attract someone to our gas station. So build something unusual. There's one in Washington that I think has a dinosaur. There's another one that's shaped like a teapot, all sorts of sort of funny little things. And this guy got in his mind that he was going to build one out of petrified wood, of which there's a lot of petrified wood in the area. And I'll eventually get to the geology. But when I was doing the research for it, they took out an ad in the local newspaper, sent in a letter to the editor. I forget exactly which one I did, but and said, "Does anyone know anything about this petrified wood gas station?" And I got an email from a guy named Elmer Sniff, which is such a great name. He's a veterinarian. He was, I think, like in his mid 80s. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I remember when that gas station was built. And my mom said, that we knew about the petrified wood, but it was on private land. And she said, don't, we can look at it, but we can't take it." And I always knew that that guy who built it, that he stole that petrified wood. And I just thought, he's lived with this memory for 70 years or whatever it was just a hilarious story. But yeah, there were forests of trees. It's sort of unclear exactly the age. It's within a handful of million years of either side. I think around 100 million years ago. These trees lived, died, and water percolating through the wood. So the wood would have settled in river valleys with sediment around it. Water percolating through the wood was rich in minerals, primarily in quartz, and it basically was a cell by cell replacement of rock with wood, replacing the wood, and you get these petrified wood, and that's it occurs all over the world. This just happened to be a really nice area for it, and the wood had been exposed at the surface of the petrified wood, easy to go and collect, steal from this guy's from private land around there. And so they built this little gas station. And it's fun because you look at the gas station, I mean, it looks just like wood. In particular, I remember there was a piece where you went under in the door frame, and this massive piece to sort of hold up the door frame. And you could see the limbs, you could see areas where there was sort of the cross section of the wood. Yeah, just a stunningly beautiful, really fun little building. And then if you go around the side, the mortar on the side of the building was green, so it's like there are vines winding up through the building. It's a clever little building. It's not been a gas station for years, and when I went and visited it, the guy who had it would park like big Suburbans in front of it, and it's a tiny little spot just sort of to hide it from the general public. I guess he didn't want people coming to it. So I never reached out to him again after I wrote the book, and whether people make I like to think they make pilgrimages to it, but I have no idea.
It's interesting, right? Because it's such an impressive building for a very small group of people. I just thought that was an interesting story because there's so much history of, as you said, like where he got the wood from. Probably someone stole it from someone else at some point, and then also what even like what year it was built in. It sounded like there were three different accounts of what summer the project was.
Right, yeah.
That
There's always that aspect of stories that you can find, depending on who you talk to, when it was built. And, for as you can imagine, particularly this little town, this little building, it's not like they were thinking, oh, 70 years from now, some dork's going to come along and want to tell the story of it. We better preserve that. But in that little town, I did find a few people who were quite passionate about it and preserving the history of the structure and the people who lived there. So that was fun. That was always a highlight for me, connecting with different researchers, either geology wise or the human history wise, who fell in love with their subject and were generally more than happy to share information with me.
Yeah, so that I thought that was pretty cool too, how many people you're able to speak with and get kind of boots on the ground opinions from these locals who either worked with the stone professionally, like as geologists, or worked with it as quarrymen, or just locals who worked nearby doing something completely different from geology, and just got to see some of the stone every day. I'm wondering if you maybe have a favorite character or two that you wanted to talk about that you got to interview and interact with during the research phase here.
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple fun experiences. There was a guy who was very passionate and done gobs of research on the railroad at for Bunker Hill. So the the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. The quarry is in Quincy, just a little bit south, and the guy who designed it, the monument, Solomon Willard, had sort of walked all over New England and eventually ends up finding the granite he likes best, like 5 miles from where Bunker Hill Monument is going in, but it was not easy to get. So he ends up working with some people to develop one of the first commercial railroads in the United States. So there's a little bit of remnants of it, and it was built at the quarry site, and the rail, they carried the rock from the quarry tide line to a river about 2 miles. It was actually the initial railroad was horse drawn. But I got connected with this guy who had researched that. And so the quarry now is buried under the material that they used for excavating for the big dig in Boston. They filled in that quarry because the Quincy quarry had this reputation of kids diving into it and hitting rock and dying, and mob bodies and mob this and that thrown into it. So they decide the simplest thing is just to fill it in. So it's now covered with grass. And I went there with this guy, and he said, well, let's just go look at it. And he basically sort of like drove into the quarry site, which an area that did not look to me like you're supposed to drive. He's sort of spinning around in the mud and muck, and we get out and poke around, and he does this and that. And it's just sort of like, which is sort of a nutty guy. So that to me was a fun story. The other probably researcher, one of the most interesting, was this guy, Robert Folk, who's in the very last chapter of the book about travertine. And Folk is well known for two things. One, he sort of wrote sort of one of the main books on sedimentary geology decades and decades ago. But then he also later in his life got focused on these nanobacteria, this, microscopic life forms that were from what he looked at, were essential for the formation of travertine. So travertine being this rock that forms in hot springs, so the water bubbles up, the chemistry of the water changes, and it becomes super saturated in the mineral calcite, and you get basically a limestone that forms. But folks said, no, it's due to these microscopic little life forms. And all of a sudden that becomes this super popular, everyone's starting to look for nanobacteria. You get, one group that says no, one group that says yes. The famous one is the Martian meteorite that was found, I think, in Antarctica. And they said, oh, this is evidence of life because there's calcite. And if you have calcite, then you need to have nanobacteria. And, like, oh my God, here's ET, here it is. And it's since basically been debunked. But he was just passionate about it. He was, no one was going to convince him otherwise that nanobacteria didn't exist. But also really helpful. I mean, I sent him slides. He read the paper that what I wrote. So, I've been doing research for a long time, interviewing people, and so many people are, yeah, they're just so helpful and so willing to share information about what they're doing. And, we all like that. We all like to be asked, what do we do?
Hmm.
And be able to tell stories about ourselves and our work. And that's what I do. I, go in and like, oh, tell me a cool story about what you're doing. And that's just so much fun for me. And I think often for them because I find such an interest in what they're doing and hopefully being able to share it with others.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally agree with that. Obviously, I'm doing interviews here every once in a while, so I can identify with that pretty.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to talk about was, yeah, I know I mentioned this briefly earlier. The marble that Michelangelo worked with, if I remember right, that is mostly limestone. Yeah, can you tell us maybe a little bit about that? Anything?
About Michelangelo? Yeah, Michelangelo, the marble there comes from Carrara, which is on the west side of Italy, a little bit north of Pisa. And those quarries have been in use for, I think, since Roman times, for now 2000 plus years. And Michelangelo, uh, the David is made out of Carrara marble, the Pieta, Moses, all his sort of great sculptures are made out of marble. And that marble began life as a limestone in a very pure limestone in a shallow sea. So lots of calcium carbonate being deposited. And then 20 million years ago or so, if I remember correctly, a little microcontinent ran into Italy and basically piled all this rock on top of the limestone and then over time metamorphosed it. And so if you go to Carrara, they're described as the Marble Mountains. When you're driving in from the coast, you see these mountains and they're white. It looks like they're snow, but it actually is a marble. And so I mean they're really beautiful. There's a phenomenal number of quarries in that area, in the Carrara area. There's like two or three main quarry areas with multiple quarries within those. They've been, as I said, been worked for 2000 plus years. I was lucky enough to team up with an Italian geologist and go out and spend time with him. We went through the quarries to see what was going on there. And one of my favorite stories was that Michelangelo decided he wanted to, in Florence, do the facade of a church there and was going to use columns of Carrara marble, solid columns. And the Romans had done that, but for the 1500 years or so after the sort of heyday of the Romans, columns had been built by basically stacking donuts of rock, little chunks, and then making a column. And Michelangelo proposed to take single columns out of the Carrara quarry. And it's just this epic tale of how these massive blocks being slid down and almost killing Michelangelo and other workers when one escapes, and then you get it down out of the mountains, and you got to pull it across the plains to eventually to get to a ship to sail down to Rome, to the river, or up to Florence. So just some fun, really interesting, fun stories about the the human history again, and then just this wonderful geological history too. And as you drive up into Carrara, up into the mountains, you can drive from the limestone into the marble. And there's, the areas where you're basically limestone and marble right next to each other as you get to the point where the rock had been metamorphosed. So yeah, great geology.
Yeah, yeah. The stuff about Michelangelo transporting rocks was so interesting because I realized that's never popped into my head. All these famous sculptors, they couldn't just go into a website and order limestone delivered at their apartment. They
Right.
needed to go and get it and make sure it was the right stuff and the right shapes and sizes, and they had the right equipment to transport it, which is not, again, you can't just order a tractor 500 years ago. Um,
Right. Yeah. I mean, that aspect of it, I mean, there are a variety of many of the chapters have information about that movement of stone. And as you said, it's something I think we take for granted now. You put it on a tractor, you put it on a boat, you put it on a plane, a train. And again, trains were often the driver for it. But when you get deep enough in time, 200 plus years ago and further, how did they transport? Transporting all of the travertine to from the quarries to get into Rome to make the Colosseum. And, I remember reading or talking to one of the archaeologists who, they're basically all put on carts and pulled by beasts of burden. And she made the point, like, man, the roads just must have been covered with, basically with shit from all these animals transporting, this hundreds and hundreds of loads of rock to the quarry. And that's sort of a basic thing you don't really think about.
yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, I have one more note here that I just had to mention to you. My dad, when I told him, um, I was talking to him a little bit about the Quincy quarry and that being the major source for granite for the Bunker Hill Monument. He got all excited because he grew up south of Boston and was telling me that he remembered when he was a kid. And I don't know how much of this is embellished or maybe the timelines don't really line up in terms of stories he heard from other people instead of stories he saw himself. But he claims he was there many times with friends and other people where they jumped into the quarry and he did not. But he said, lots of people jumping into the quarry and lots of injuries and stories of people hitting stuff and not coming out, or stories, as you said, of organized crime dumping stuff in there,
Yeah.
cars being dropped in there and all of that. So
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean, because what the big dig was, say, 25 plus years ago. So I mean, I lived in 96, it was still flooded then. And so, anything before the 90s. And, and there are other, you got, the classic quarry is in the movie Breaking Away, in Indiana, where if you know the movie, there's a couple great scenes in Breaking Away where they're swimming in the limestone quarries. I mean, outside of Bloomington and near Bloomington, these quarries of limestone and people swimming there. And I remember as a kid swimming in Kentucky in the quarries, in the limestone quarries. So yeah, people have been doing that for a long time.
okay, all right, maybe he has some real stories then. Okay.
Yeah, he's not making it up.
All right, thank you. Um, oh, I wanted to ask about. So you're in Seattle now. My cousins and aunt and uncle live out there. Yeah, can you talk to me a little bit about the Seattle geology in kind of urban environments?
One thing about Seattle, which is a very geologic city, but there's no building stone in the city. So when Seattle burned to the ground in 1889, and this is a story you can tell Boston, Chicago, New York, Rome, wherever you are, built place burns to the ground and they start building more with stone. And so Seattle found it in a couple quarries north and south and east, and then another sandstone, and then there's a granite that comes into the Seattle area. But all tied to the fact that they were going back to what we talked about just a minute ago. They were all connected to easy means of transportation. So rock gets brought into Seattle because it's right about the time when the first railroads go through the Cascades, and they're able to bring the stone in, or one of the quarries is actually located right on Puget Sound, so they could float rock down the sound into Seattle. So we have a variety of local building stones that are used always in the older buildings in Seattle. Really, I think very lovely rock. But geology also is central to the story of Seattle. There's sort of two main aspects of the story. There's the glacial aspect. Like Boston, Seattle was covered by the Seattle area was covered by a glacier during the last ice age. It came out of Canada, plowed between the Olympic and Cascade Mountains, made it south, about 60 miles south of Seattle, and then retreated or melted back to the north. And as that ice moved across, two things happened. One, water flowing underneath the ice carved into the sediments and formed Puget Sound and Lake Washington, these which are quite deep structures. Puget Sound's like 900 feet deep, and Lake Washington's 200 feet deep, so pretty deep. And so water carves those, but at the same time as the ice moves across the landscape, it creates this series of parallel ridges and valleys. Basically, think of the ice as a rake scraping the land and creating basically drumlins, like in Boston, the drumlins of Boston. And that created a very challenging topography for people to move through and really ultimately shapes a lot of the stories of the city of how transportation networks are built. A couple of big projects of literally removing hills or regrading hills, as we call it in Seattle, because they're in the way and we were trying to deal with them. So geology is very intimately tied to the surface topography. And then at the same time, there are three major fault zones that affect the city. One, a subduction zone out on the coast, one, that same subduction zone underneath Puget Sound, and then another zone of weakness that's due to sort of plate movement moving north and running into Seattle. So we have this deep history of earthquakes and how that then has again also contributed to the topography of Seattle. So, I mean, I always like to make the point when I talk to groups about Seattle geology is that A, it affects us every single day, and B, it has had a significant effect on the story of the city. You can't really separate how Seattle developed as a city from its geology. Not that that's unique. Most places have that connection, but Seattle, it's just very clear that connection between geology and human history.
Is there any type of rock specifically I should tell my cousins to go out and look for out there?
At the surface, not much. I have a few favorite spots of geology, in particular in West Seattle. There's some lovely, interesting geology at low tide that appears that ties to the fault, to this area called the Seattle Fault, this zone of weakness that runs through the city. In particular, there was a big earthquake in either 923 or 924. We know that dating exact dating, not from indigenous story. There were certainly people here, and the story of this earthquake appears in indigenous stories. But they did a couple of years ago came out with this really great paper looking of tree ring analysis, and they were able to put together a variety of different data from around the Puget Lowland of tree rings and narrowed down when this fault occurred. And when it occurred, the uplift was about 20 feet across the fault. And in particular, there are areas where you can see where beds of intertidal organisms were basically pushed out, thrust out of the water 20 feet. And so the beds are filled with sediment and dead um, mollusks and such that because they were now out of the water and they all die at that point. So I think it's just sort of an interesting story. You can also see material from where the lahars, these big mud flows washing off Mount Rainier, came in. So lots going on.
Was there anything that really shocked you when you were writing this book and kind of going through the research phase and traveling to these different places?
I'm actually shocked just but how the variety of stone that people use and the way they used it always intrigued me, from this petrified wood gas station to a fort in St. Augustine, this Spanish fort that was built in St. Augustine, Florida, with these walls that are 15 feet thick, made out of coquina, which is, sort of an incipient limestone. It's a limestone sort of in the making. The analogy I use, it's almost like a building is made of a granola bar, except with shells. I mean, and so when the British attacked the fort, the cannon balls they would use would basically get embedded. It almost like it just sort of got stuck in the rock, and the Spanish would go out at night and pull out the cannonballs and sort of patch it up so that the British didn't know couldn't figure out where things were being weakened. To looking at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and the travertine that's used there that was brought all the way around the world. And the fact that, that rock is shipped all over the place. You go to any major city in the country and you will find rock from everywhere in the world. Basically, any continent except Antarctica, you will find rock used in an urban environment. So, just this elemental nature of the geology that is always around us. And, to me, this that people take for granted. I mean, one thing I lead these tours all the time. People are like, wow, I've never noticed that. You can find rocks with wonderful building stone with wonderful fossils in them, rocks that go back 3.5 billion years in age, rocks from all over the world. And I think that's just sort of a fun part of the story. And to me, a great way to engage people in geology, get them interested in it. So maybe not shocked, but just how appealing I think building stone is as a geolog, as a way to share those stories, as I keep saying, of human and natural history.
Thank you so much, David. Is there anything else you want to talk about today? Anything else you wanted to tell people about while I have you on the call here?
I guess I'll put in I'll be purely selfish and self-promotion. So if you are interested, I have a website, geologywriter.com, and in particular, I produce a weekly newsletter about human and natural history, primarily focused on the Pacific Northwest. But I like to think it's sort of a fun thing, a way to think about the connections, often the connections to the urban environment in natural history, whether it's geology or botany or how people the built environment. How do we relate to place? So if you're interested in that to me is sort of a fun way I like to think a fun way to stay in connection with what I'm doing, and then have people share stories. That to me is always fun. I hear fun stories from people. So yeah.
That's right. I think we first connected through Substack. Can you remind me what your Substack and website name are?
My website is geologywriter.com, and the Substack is the Street Smart Naturalist. And there's a link on my Geology Writer website, sort of the easiest link to get to it. But it's free, comes out weekly. It's all over the place.
No, I really appreciate it again. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it again. If you've made it to the end of this episode, I'm here to let you know that you are legally required to subscribe to Rocks for Jocks Substack. Click the link in the description of this episode to enter your email and receive a free podcast and newsletter delivered to your inbox every month. Thanks for listening.